Oh. I know you're starting, or indeed you have already started, a series in the studies in John's Gospel. And last week, I believe, you were looking at the latter half of chapter 1. This morning, we're going to jump backwards and consider the opening few verses. And as we look at them, we'll see that they're profound, they're deep, they're glorious, they're wonderful, they're marvelous, they're encouraging, they're uplifting. And in the short time that we've got, we're only just going to be able to scratch the surface, but hopefully we'll be encouraged by that scratching. Before we read the passage, I wonder if you have ever been to a grand old building, perhaps an old hotel or a museum or a library that has a wonderful, marvelous foyer or entrance before you go in. And you get, as you go into the foyer, you get a sense of grandeur and what to expect when you actually enter the building. Well, it's been said that the opening verses of John's Gospel are rather like a foyer, drawing us into the Gospel and giving us a foretaste, a glimpse of the splendor that we can expect when we get inside. And so these first few verses of this first chapter, we're introduced to some major themes. So we see light, life, glory, grace, truth, blessings, witness, the world, and so on. And as we read these verses in chapter 1 of John's Gospel, we want to go further on and we want to see more and to learn more. So let's read together the first 18 verses of John 1, and we'll enter that foyer together, and we'll spend a little bit of time considering these verses once we've read them. So if you have a Bible, could you turn in it, please, to John chapter 1. And I'd like to read the first 18 verses. So, John chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. The lightness shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it. There came a man who was sent from God. His name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all men might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. The true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet, to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, or a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testifies concerning him. He cries out, saying, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me." From the fullness of his grace, we have all received one blessing after another. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, who is at the Father's side, has made him known. I wonder how many of us have had the experience of hearing the doorbell go and opening it to find two people standing there dressed in dark suits with briefcases in hand. And they introduce themselves along the lines of, "Good morning, sir. We're in your area today teaching people the good news of the kingdom." Or, "Good morning, madam. Isn't the world in a desperate mess? Have you ever wondered why?" Who's at the door? Well, it's likely to be the Jehovah's Witnesses. How do you react? Does your heart sink? Do you think, oh dear me, I just haven't got time for this? Or perhaps your heart goes out to them and you think, how can I help these desperately sincere people understand the gospel? Well, I reckon my first experience of having the Jehovah's Witnesses at the door was when I was about 17. And I recognised one of the people in the dark suit as a kid from my school who was in the same year as me. And immediately I thought, this poor guy has been conned. And he's getting dragged around the streets, knocking on door after door. And so I spent about 20 minutes trying to point out, as only a 17-year-old can, in a none too diplomatic way, that he'd been conned and he needed to see the error of his ways. And you see, if you've ever been in conversation with a Jehovah's Witness, sincere as they are, you'll eventually come to a point where they deny the deity of Jesus. And in their so-called translation of the Bible, which is really not a proper translation at all, it contains some devious and deliberate errors that enable them to deny that Jesus is God. They are not mainstream Christianity in any way, shape, or form, and they teach heresy. And their view of Jesus is seriously flawed. We, and it's great in terms of the song choice this morning, we've been making much of Jesus and who he is. And that last song about him being king. So we've been making much of Jesus, but the Jehovah's Witnesses have a low view in many respects of who Jesus is. They deny his deity, but they are not the only ones. We live in a society that peddles all sorts of incorrect views about Jesus. In our bookcase, we have a copy of the Concise Oxford English Dictionary, and looking up Jesus in that dictionary, you'll find this definition: an exclamation of surprise, dismay, etc. And then it goes on in brackets to say, founder of the Christian religion. So to some people, the compilers of our Oxford English Dictionary included, Jesus is primarily a swear word. To others, they would maybe see him as a good man. Perhaps some would see him as a mythical figure. Others maybe recognise him as a great teacher. Still others, perhaps as an example to follow. A few years ago, a survey was conducted in Brent Cross Shopping Centre, of all places, and 1,000 children were asked a multiple-choice question. Who is Jesus Christ? A footballer for Chelsea, B, the Son of God, C, a TV presenter, or D, an astronaut. 20% of them opted for the footballer. Another survey around the same time concluded that a third of children aged 10 to 13 in the UK do not know that Christmas celebrates the birth of Jesus. So I don't think you would disagree with me when I say that we live in a society that has a variety of views on Jesus, or indeed no understanding at all about him. And it is important, therefore, that we are confident in our biblical belief as to who Jesus is. And so in looking at these first few verses of John's Gospel, I'd like us to see that they proclaim the deity of Jesus, the godhood of Jesus. He was and is God the Son. And among many other things that these verses show us, I'd like us to see that firstly we see the deity of Jesus is unambiguous and profound. And then secondly, the deity of Jesus is enlightening and life-giving. And then thirdly, the deity of Jesus is blessing upon blessing. And what we'll do is we'll consider each of those in turn, beginning with the deity of Jesus being unambiguous and profound. Down through the centuries, the deity of Jesus has regularly been challenged. Academics and even theologians have come out with all sorts of denials of the godhood of Jesus. So, for example, some have said that Jesus never really thought of himself as God incarnate or the Messiah, but these were ideas that were later written into the Gospels, so that it appeared that Jesus was making these claims. Why would they deny the deity of Jesus? Well, it's always suited the political and cultural climate of the day. And it does, in our day, just as much as it ever did. You see, without the claim that Jesus is God, we can, for instance, suggest that all faiths are equal and have equal status, and then perhaps achieve better social harmony. Some of you will recall, maybe not all of you go quite this far back, but as far back as 1994, when he was still Prince Charles, he suggested that when he became king, he would be defender of faith rather than defender of the faith. And back in the 90s, when he said that, he was effectively denying the uniqueness of Christianity, effectively a denial of the deity of Jesus. A Christianity that makes radical claims about the deity of Jesus can be seen as a thorn in the side of attempts to achieve a harmonious plural society, because it upsets the status quo. If Jesus is actually God, then there are profound implications, and people veer away from that. If Jesus is God, then we have to take his claims seriously. We have to listen to what he says in terms of his teaching. But if he's not God, then people can take or leave his claims. They can accept the bits of his teaching that they like and ignore those that they don't. Denying the deity of Jesus is also something that is high on the agenda of Satan. So it's not a surprise that it's been under attack ever since the earliest days of the church. If Jesus is not God, then his death on the cross becomes just a sad end to a good life, or the ultimate example of a self-sacrifice, but it doesn't atone for sin. And so Satan robs people of the eternal salvation, which is only to be found in Christ. So it's very important, therefore, that we understand and are confident in who Jesus is. It's imperative that we can unashamedly declare his deity. Otherwise, we'll be in danger of being tossed back and forth by all sorts of erroneous teaching, and we can begin to doubt our faith when trials or difficulties come along, or when the Mormons or the Jehovah's Witnesses knock at the door, or when the latest TV documentary hits our screens claiming to reveal a different Jesus. We must be confident in his deity, in his godhood, and these verses declare it in an unambiguous way. So straight away in verse 1, we read, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." And then as we read on, it becomes very clear that John is talking about Jesus. He tells us that Jesus is distinct from God the Father, but nevertheless is categorically declared to be God. The Word was God. Now, I've used the Jehovah's Witnesses as an example because they translate the end of verse 1 as "the Word was a God, little g," thereby suggesting that Jesus was in some way heavenly, but not fully God. No recognized Greek scholar anywhere in the world would support their translation. There is absolutely no ambiguity here. John, in the very first verse of his gospel, declares the deity of Jesus. And then he then goes on to reinforce it as we continue to read the first few verses. Verse 3 tells us that Jesus is the God of creation. Now we know from Genesis chapter 1 that God created the heavens and the earth, and here John tells us that Jesus was the God of creation. Through him all things were made, without him nothing was made that has been made. And verse 10 reiterates that point. The world was made through him. Genesis chapter 1 and John chapter 1 are in harmony in the sense that they reinforce the plurality of the Godhead. In Genesis 1 verse 26, God is recorded as saying, "Let us make man in our own image," not "let me make man in my image." The language in Genesis chapter 1 is us and our, and so it's no surprise when we get to John chapter 1 that we read of Jesus as the God of creation alongside God the Father. And then right at the end of our passage in verse 18, we get another statement about Jesus being God. "No one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, who is at the Father's side, has made him known." So John speaks here of two different persons being God. Jesus is God the Son and has revealed God the Father to us. And it isn't just these opening verses of John's Gospel that we see Jesus being declared to be God. Remember, chapter 1 is like the foyer, showing you the splendour that we see as we move into the Gospel. Well, as we go into the Gospel, we see unambiguous declarations of Jesus' deity. Jesus both claimed and accepted that he was God. At the end of chapter 10, Jesus got into a discussion at the temple with the Jews about who he was, and they wanted a plain answer. And after Jesus had given them an answer, they picked up stones to stone him. And Jesus asked him, "Oh, well, why are you doing this?" And their reply in verse 33 of John chapter 10 was, "Well, we aren't stoning you for your miracles, but for blasphemy, because you, a mere man, claim to be God." They were outraged and they were incensed because Jesus was claiming deity. And that wasn't a misunderstanding. They hadn't misheard him. They hadn't misinterpreted his claims. Jesus was claiming to be God. And in chapter 8, a couple of chapters earlier, there was another occasion when the Jews were discussing with Jesus his claims about himself. And that time as well, they tried to stone him because in verse 58 of chapter 8, Jesus had said, "Before Abraham was born, I am." Jesus was declaring himself to be God by taking upon himself the title that God had used in Exodus chapter 3. So the Jews were repeatedly outraged by Jesus' claim to deity. And that's why they pressured Pilate to have him crucified. Chapter 19, verse 7, the Jews insisted that Jesus die because he claimed to be the Son of God. There's no ambiguity about who Jesus claimed to be. But not only claiming to be God and claiming deity, Jesus readily accepted the acknowledgement of others that he was God. And the disciple Thomas sometimes gets a bad rap because of his doubts about Jesus' resurrection. But he sets us the most wonderful example when he comes face to face with the risen Jesus. And at the end of John chapter 20, Jesus invites Thomas to touch the wounds of his crucifixion. Instead, Thomas, in verse 28 of John 20, just exclaims, "My Lord and my God." Jesus accepted that acknowledgement. He didn't correct Thomas because there was nothing to correct. Thomas was absolutely right. My Lord and my God. So the words of John chapter 1, verse 1 are unambiguous. They're profound. They declare the deity of Jesus. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Secondly, the opening verses of John's Gospel show us Jesus' deity is enlightening and life-giving. Verse 4 tells us that in him was life, and that life was the light of men. And then verse 9 tells us the true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world. Not a light, but the true light. And again, this is absolutely staggering. In verses 12 and 13, we're told that Jesus gave the right to those who believed on him to become children of God. Again, profound and staggering, because becoming a child of God is to be given ultimate life, true life, eternal life. And it leads us further into the Gospel, chapter 3, where we get to hear Jesus telling the religious leader, Nicodemus, "You must be born again." Light and life go together. Without light, there's no life. Now, we're not long out of December. We're now into mid-January. We're moving through the dark days of winter. If we look out onto our gardens or go for a walk in our parks at this time of year, we see that life is limited. There are no flowers. The grass isn't growing. The colours are drab. Tree branches are bare. But as we begin to move into longer days with more light, spring arrives. Bulbs push up their shoots. Leaves unfurl. Colours start appearing. and with extended light comes life. A few years ago, National Geographic magazine had an article entitled "The Power of Light," and it pointed out that light reveals the world to us. I've lost my, body and soul crave it. Light sets our biological clocks. It triggers our brains with the sensations of colour. Light feeds us, supplying energy for plants to grow. It inspires us with special effects like rainbows and sunsets. Light gives us life-changing tools, from incandescent bulbs to lasers to fibre optics. Scientists don't fully understand what light is or what it can do, this article said. They just know that it will illuminate our future. We need light to survive and flourish. How much more, then, do we need the true light that gives light to everyone for our eternal survivement and flourishment? And so as we go through the foyer of chapter 1, deeper into John's Gospel, Jesus is recorded as declaring himself to be the light of the world in chapter 8, verse 12. I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And chapter 10, verse 10, he declares that he came that we might have life and have it to the full. If we take John chapter 1 seriously and acknowledge Jesus as our God, then we begin to realize that we need him to bring us true life and light. Without him, we're not enlightened. We're still living in darkness. And so we're impoverished because we don't have the fullness of life that he came to bring. So these verses show us that the deity of Jesus is unambiguous, it's profound. They tell us that it's enlightening and life-giving. And then thirdly, they tell us that the deity of Jesus is blessing upon blessing. Verse 16, from the fullness of his grace we have all received one blessing after another. Just let's pause for a second. Let's just let that sink in. From the fullness of his grace we have all received one blessing after another. Verse 12 tells us that if we have received him and believed in his name, he's welcomed us into the family of God. So there's blessing number one, if you like. You're a child of the living God. But it doesn't stop there. Verse 16 says it's one blessing after another, blessing upon blessing upon blessing. It does us well to stop and reflect on the blessing after blessing that Jesus has given us. But somehow, we're often not very good at doing that. Too often, we're better at focusing on the things that we don't have. Books have been published recently, in recent years, on the rise of this concept of victimhood, focusing on things that folk don't have. We can naturally play the victim and feel hard done by, but we need to change from that perspective, because the deity of Jesus, he's brought us blessing upon blessing, eternal salvation, forgiveness, redemption, an eternal future. Ephesians 1 reminds us God has blessed us in the heavenly realms with every spiritual blessing in Christ. I read a book at the end of last year called The War on the West by a guy called Douglas Murray, looking at some of the issues, as he sees it, that are eating away at Western culture. But what I found most interesting in the whole of that book was a chapter, or an interlude almost, that he had in that book on gratitude. And he suggests that our culture has lost its ability to feel gratitude. Now, as far as I'm aware, he's not a Christian, but his insights were very pertinent. And he says this: without some proper sense of gratitude, it's impossible to get anything into any proper order. Without an ability to feel gratitude, all of human life and human experience is a marketplace of blame, where people find other people to blame and upon whom they can transfer their frustrations. That should not be the Christian experience, because Jesus has brought us blessing after blessing after blessing. And verse 16 says that it is all of us who have received that abundance of blessing. Not a few of us, not some of us, not most of us, but all of us. And it would do us good regularly to reflect on those blessings and thank God for them. We ought to be people of gratitude. There's an old hymn, and it's a good old hymn, and it says this: count your blessings, name them one by one, and it'll surprise you what the Lord has done. So one blessing after another. Do we reflect on them? Do we thank God for them? For the big things, salvation, forgiveness, an eternal future, for the daily blessings, for our food, our clothes, our homes, for the blessings of family, friends, and church, for the blessings of spiritual gifts, for experience, for skills, for blessings in the tough times that have taught us resilience and trust, for the blessings brought to us in answered prayer. Let's be a people with a gratitude attitude, because Jesus has brought us one blessing after another. And on that positive note of thankfulness, let's draw this to a close. John chapter 1 is a wonderful chapter, packed with deep, profound and glorious truths. It's a foyer that leads us into the rest of the book, which expands on those truths. Not least of which is the deity of Jesus, which is unambiguous and profound, which is enlightening and life-giving, and pouring out on us blessing after blessing after blessing. May God continue to bless us as we reflect on these things. And may we be people with a gratitude attitude as we thank him for those blessings. Thank you very much.